Say again. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this live streamed presentation of a lecture by Professor Elaine Howard Ecklund of Rice University, sponsored by the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum. Professor Ecklund is giving a lecture tonight titled, "What Scientists Think About Religion and the Common Values That Bring Science and Faith Communities Together." I am Nels Hoffman, and I'm the chair of the forum's speaker committee, and I will be your host and moderator for tonight. We are looking forward to an inspiring and edifying talk by Professor Ecklund this evening. Before we introduce her, however, I'd like to introduce a couple of people who have been instrumental in making tonight's talk possible. I should say 3 people. I do want to acknowledge Bob Reinofsky, who is the vice president of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum, and who is also the Zoom technical host, and he is running the show behind the scenes. And now, I would like to welcome Jonas Chin of the Rice University Development Office, who played a key role in setting up our first contact with Professor Ecklund and the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University, which she directs. So we'd like to turn it over now to Jonas Chin. So Jonas.
Thank you, Nels, and good evening, everyone from Houston, Texas, and Rice University. On behalf of all of us on campus, we wanted to express our gratitude to the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum and Nels, also a Rice alum, and all the alumni who've been engaged and involved in helping us make tonight possible. We know that you're going to enjoy the talk presented by Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund. But one last thing I wanted to mention is that I am involved with our New Mexico alumni parents, and it turns out that we have great ties in Los Alamos. We have over 50 parents and alumni who are currently in the area, and we have over 298 alumni across the state. If you're tuning in tonight, greetings from your alma mater, Rice University. And we're also very privileged and honored to welcome the Max Roy Scholarship each year at Rice, and that's awarded to a student from a Los Alamos high school. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate tonight. We wish we were there with you in New Mexico, and enjoy tonight's lecture.
Thank you very much, Jonas. We sure appreciate all you've done to make this talk possible tonight. And now I would like to turn the program over to Dan Winsky, who is the president of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum. Dan?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'd first like to thank members and friends of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum for joining us this evening. In addition, I'd like to welcome those joining us with a relation to Rice University and to Jonas Chin, who just briefly spoke here in arranging this. And finally, I'd like to welcome any of you out there who heard of this event through BioLogos. Let me say a bit about the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum. We are a group of scientists, engineers, professionals, clergy, and laity here in Los Alamos, New Mexico, helping each other in our community to think about science and religion and about the harmony and complementarity of these two modes of being and knowing by providing information, education, and a framework for dialogue. We are committed to delving deeper into the discoveries and mysteries of both religion and science and how each can inform and enrich the other. Established in 2014, we have presented a series of lectures every summer on a wide range of topics. In the past years, these lectures were held weekly in the evening, preceded by a light supper and followed by small group discussions. We usually have a theme for each summer's talks, along with an external speaker. For example, in 2015, our first speakers were Deborah and Lauren Harzma. Deborah is, of course, now president of BioLogos. I don't know, am I still on the air here? My screen is gone. Okay, anyway, because of COVID-19, of course, we've had to forego our usual format this summer, and our lectures were all presented via Zoom. While we did have to give up our small group discussions, this did allow us to reach a wider audience. Lectures for the past several summers are available at our website, which is our initials, lafsf.org, or just look us up on Google. On the website, you can find out about joining us by becoming a member of the forum. Again, thank you for joining us this evening for what we expect to be a very stimulating and thought-provoking lecture by Professor Ecklund. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So now, before we get started, let me just go through a few logistics for our live stream presentation. We are recording the presentation tonight. If you are uncomfortable with there being a recording of our time together, please leave the meeting now. Our presenter will be taking questions via Zoom chat after the talk. During the talk, we will mute all microphones to avoid background noise and interruptions. During the talk, you can type your questions into the Zoom chat panel. To find the chat feature, look for the Zoom app menu bar. You might have to move your cursor around within the Zoom window for the menu bar to show up. You'll either see a chat icon in the menu bar, or you might need to click More in the menu bar to find the chat feature. After the talk, we will relay the questions to our speaker. If you have additional questions, we may have time for a live question and answer period after we address the questions in the chat. Okay, so now let's get started. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Elaine Howard Ecklund is the Herbert S. Autrey Chair in Social Sciences and a professor of sociology at Rice University, as well as the founding director of the Religion and Public Life program. Ecklund is a sociologist of religion, immigration, and science who examines how individuals bring change to religious and scientific institutions. She is the author of 4 books with Oxford University Press, 1 book with New York University Press, and 1 book with Brazos Press, and numerous research articles and op-ed pieces. Her most recent book is titled Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. And this was published by Brazos Press in 2020. She has received grants from the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Her research has been cited thousands of times by local, national, and international media. In 2013, she received Rice University's Charles O. Duncan Award for Most Outstanding Academic Achievement and Teaching. And in 2018, she gave the prestigious Gifford Lecture at the University of Edinburgh. Now I'll turn it over to Elaine and we'll monitor questions and comments coming in on the chat for discussion later. Elaine.
Thank you so much for having me, Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum, and thanks to those who are listening. It is really an honor to be here, and I think a special honor in these times. I was saying to a friend today that I can't, some days I feel like I just can't possibly stand any more Zoom meetings. And then here you are listening to me in the evening, probably during your dinner hour, doing one more Zoom meeting. At the same time, I think the way that we're living our lives now brings some interesting, if I might be so bold to say, almost redemptive possibilities that we can gather across space in ways that we really generally would not be able to do, that we can get together more frequently, and we can have people from across the country and across different areas join us for the same topic. So really appreciate you all for being here, for making this possible. So tonight I want to go ahead and share some information about my research through the Religion and Public Life program. For the past 15 years, I and colleagues at Rice University's Religion and Public Life program have been studying what scientists think about religion and what religious people think about science. And I can remember exactly when I first thought, oh, I ought to study that. I was a young graduate student doing research on how religion was bringing changes to the way we think about family in the US. And as part of my research, I was attending Bible studies. And I remember interacting with a woman at this Bible study that I was attending for research purposes. This was when I was a student at Cornell University in upstate New York. And the woman said, what do you do for your work? A seemingly benign question you might ask someone. And I said, oh, I'm a graduate student at Cornell University. And she said, yuck. And I thought, ugh, why wouldn't she like Cornell University? Cornell University, I don't know if you all know, is an Ivy League school. Most people would think of it as a good thing to get a child into Cornell University. And she said, I'd never send my kids to Cornell because the scientists there might take them away from their faith. And I thought, wow, I wonder if that's really the case. And years later, I got a chance to start a study of scientists' attitudes towards religion, that really the seed of my first study on this topic was birthed from that conversation with that woman in a church in upstate New York. So even though she doesn't know me, I thank her for getting me started on this research train. So for the past 8 years or so, my team and I have been doing work on what scientists think about religion. And then after that, I started to do some individual work as well, in particular, looking at the common values that might bring together scientific and faith communities. And I was particularly interested in how these things might work out for conservative Christian communities, which are the communities in the US that are thought to have the most antagonism towards science as a result of their faith. And I wanted to figure out if that was really true and if there are areas of common ground. So I'll share that work tonight with you a little bit as well. And then I'll share a little bit about our broader research and programming through the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. So I want to go through 5 things tonight. I want to try to convince you of 5 things. I actually had to narrow it down. There's so much more that I could share, but if you want to read more, I hope you'll pick up one of our books. But these are the 5 things that I want to go over briefly tonight. I want to argue that studying religion and science, I think, is deeply significant and an important research topic for scientists and philosophers and theologians to be interested in, but also for social scientists like me to be interested in and contribute to, especially now in these pandemic times. I want to convince you that around the world, there are actually many more religious scientists than popular media and other accounts would lead us to believe. I want to convince you that most scientists do not actually think that there is a conflict between religion and science. And I want to show you by talking about 2 of the shared values out of the 8 that I write about in my book, that science and faith need each other, especially during these times. I want to end by talking with you a little bit about the broader work of the Religion and Public Life program, and I'm showing you some ways that you might want to get involved if you're interested in some of the research and programming that we do. And especially now that we can attend so many things on Zoom, I'd like to invite you to some of our future programming. So studying religion and science is incredibly important. 5.8 billion individuals, or nearly 84% of the global population, is religious, and many of those who don't think of themselves as religious in the traditional sense are involved in some sort of spirituality. Science is also incredibly important in our world. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, estimates that in 2007, and the year since, this number has continued to grow, that the global science and engineering workforce in OECD countries was 4.2 million. Of course, there are many more religious people than there are scientists, and some people overlap, are both scientists and religious people. But even though the number in the scientific workforce globally is much smaller than the number of those who are religious, we know that science is a way that nations grow economically, and any nation that is trying to grow its economic infrastructure is also trying to grow its scientific and technological infrastructure. And so we know science is incredibly important for advancement globally. And science and faith, the science and faith interface, lives large in the public imagination around the world. We need only to look towards our neighbors in the UK, where Richard Dawkins, who is the former chair of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, outspoken scientist, a well-known scientist who's written a very famous book, which stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for many weeks, The God Delusion, who argues vehemently that being a scientist means that you cannot be a religious person, and that science very conclusively stamps out religion. We also, of course, have examples like this, outspoken Francis Collins, who's a very committed Christian, currently head of our National Institutes of Health, director of the Human Genome Project, who argues also forcefully that his own scientific understanding and Christian faith are deeply compatible. These are two scientists that have written very well-known books. We also know that the science and faith interface lives large in the public sphere. So in the US, we've had incredible discussions about the connection between the Bible or not and scientific understanding. We've talked a lot about evolution, and more recently, public discussions about religion and the connection between human reproductive genetic technologies and the morality of those technologies. We also know that in places like the Middle Eastern nations, in Turkey, and other nations around the world, that there is deep public discussion and sometimes debate and even violence under certain conditions about the connection between religion and science. So as a social scientist, it's incredibly important for someone like me to bring our tools to bear on what scientists and religious people really think, a broad set of people, not just the loudest voices. And that's, I think, what social science can do for us, can help us understand if the voices that are screaming the loudest are really the most typical voices in these spheres. In these particular COVID-19 times, there are a variety of public science and public religious voices that are coming to bear. Jerry Coyne, who's an evolutionary biologist who's very outspoken against religion, is at University of Chicago, said this: "Isn't God empathetic enough to recognize that it's okay to worship him from home? There are online services, you know, and note the conflict between faith and fact again, belying theologians' claims that religion is not at war with science. Well, now it's at war with a virus, and faith won't beat that virus, science will." So really going forward with this idea of a warfare motif between science and religion, and in Coyne's sense of things, is something that is very, very consequential right now. He's arguing that people's religious beliefs will not allow them to close their churches during pandemic times. We incidentally at Rice University are doing a small study through the Religion and Public Life program. We're actually examining what faith communities are really doing in Houston, and we're hoping to expand that to other cities across the US to really understand what faith communities are doing and how they're responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, Francis Collins, who has said this about COVID-19 and faith, arguing no gatherings greater than 10 and better no gatherings at all, and that's painful. We all love our opportunities to have fellowship, to be together, to go to book clubs and go to parties together. And this is unfortunately the worst thing we could be doing, including going to church, unfortunately, which is another place where many of these infections have been spread. So really encouraging his Christian brethren not to meet together during pandemic times. So in the midst of this, one of our studies has looked at scientists in 8 different national contexts around the world and tried to understand what a broad set of scientists think about religion and think about the interface between science and religion. And in the next movement of this talk, I want to share with you some of our very sweeping skim of what this study is showing. We've actually written a 400-page book about the study and many research articles. So if you find that this whets your appetite, I can easily point you to those materials. So we looked at 8 international contexts. These are the international contexts that we looked at. 2 disciplines, all fields of biology and all fields of physics. These are disciplines which are structurally present in each of the national contexts we studied. They're also disciplines which have very different proportions of women. And we know that religiosity and gender are very connected. They're also disciplines that have very distinctive histories and present realities related to the religion and science interface. We worked together as a team. This is a very large study. Over 100 people worked with me in total on our team. We had multiple PIs, including myself. I worked with over 80 undergraduate students at Rice University throughout the 5 years that this study took place. And one of the things those wonderfully bright undergraduates at Rice University did is help me actually put together an enormous list of over 61,000 scientists, so those who were eligible to take part in our survey. We then took a random sample according to the categories that we were interested in studying of 22,525 scientists, and we surveyed them. We got anywhere between a 30 and a 70% response, depending on the nation that we were studying. And then we decided that we wanted to actually have face-to-face conversation with scientists, or phone or Skype conversation with scientists, to really understand how they saw the connection between religion and science in their own terms. And to that end, we did 609 in-depth interviews. So one of the results of that project is this book, Secularity and Science: What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. So just to whet your appetite for this broader work, here are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about from that project. So around the world, there are more religious scientists than we might think. So here is the proportion of scientists who say that they are religious in these 8 national contexts. So we see that in France, in the UK, in the United States, and Hong Kong, between 16 and 39% of scientists see themselves as religious. This might not be anything to write home about, but it certainly is a significant minority of scientists in each of these national contexts. But when we move to Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, and India, the numbers go up quite a bit: 52%, 54%, 55%, 59% of scientists in those national contexts see themselves as religious. Then we looked at how scientists compare to the general population in these national contexts. You'll see that in places like France, the US, and the United Kingdom, that there's quite a greater proportion of people in the general population who see themselves as religious when compared to scientists. This has potentially some interesting implications for public debate and dialogue, because we might imagine that if the share of scientists and those in the general public, if that gap is quite large, that we would anticipate that dialogue would not be great between scientists and members of the religious public. So for example, if both groups aren't very religious, we might expect that they wouldn't care very much about these issues at all. But if one group is very religious and the other group is not very religious, we might expect that they're on different pages about these things potentially. Let me show you this. In Turkey, Italy, and the United States and the United Kingdom, there's quite a large gap, although certainly in Italy and Turkey, the proportion of scientists in the general population who consider themselves religious is quite high in both of those national contexts. But look at Taiwan and Hong Kong. I mean, this is something I'm happy to pick up on in the question and answer if you want to talk more about it. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, actually the proportion reverses, where there are more scientists who consider themselves religious when compared to the general population. So the greater proportion of scientists who are religious and a lesser proportion of the people in the general population are religious in those two national contexts. The other thing I want to talk about a bit and assert to you is that according to our research, most scientists do not think there is a conflict between religion and science. So look at this table for a moment. This is the proportion of people who respond to the survey question. For me personally, my understanding of science and religion can be described as a relationship of conflict. And we did this a little bit differently than some other survey researchers have done in the past. We asked them if they considered there to be a conflict between religion and science, and if they were on the side of science, or if they considered there to be a conflict between science and religion, and they were on the side of religion. And you'll see that that actually very, very few people, so few that I didn't even put it up here, very few people consider themselves to have a conflict between science and religion and consider themselves to be on the side of religion. The modal proportion is independence, that scientists in all of the national contexts, at least a significant minority, think that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality. So even in France, which we think of as a very secular state, 63% of scientists think that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality. 66% of scientists in Taiwan, 61% of scientists in Italy, 57% of scientists in the US think that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality. When we look at collaboration, I think it's quite interesting. We do see that there is a significant minority in all of the contexts except France who think that science and religion can each be used to support the other. And I want to focus in for a moment on the independence and the collaboration views and how these came out in our interviews. Here's an interview with an Italian physicist who says, no, there's no conflict. Science and religion are completely distinct because there's no connection between the physical reality described by science and the existence or not existence of God. Again, there's no intersection in the sense that science can explain. In other words, you will never be able to prove or disprove God. God is outside the reach and the limits of science. So this Italian physicist, who incidentally is a Catholic, thinks that these two things are completely separate. Let's look at the collaboration view. So again, in Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, there's a significant minority of scientists, 25%, 27%, 23%, 32%, who think that there is a collaboration between these two realms, between science and religion, and that they each can be used to support the other. So here's what collaboration looks like. Here's an Indian biologist, and when we interviewed her, said this: yes, religion, you can say that it inspires us to be disciplined. Like we're having prayers which have definite timing. So this particular Indian biologist is Muslim. That means you have to get up early in the morning for the first prayer, and then after that, late in the night. So that means there are 5 times which are fixed for the prayer. I mean, it's just one thing you can say that if you're a discipline, so that is also one of the important factors when you are doing science. If you are disciplined, that will definitely help you. I really enjoyed this interview because it sort of blew out of the water the way that I think about these things. I always think of these things as, before I did this study, as it being about belief systems, that we're thinking about the ideas of a religious tradition like Christianity and how it connects or doesn't connect with the ideas of science. But this particular Indian biologist was interesting because she was saying it's really not so much about belief systems as it is about practices. There's the practices of religion and science that support one another for her, that she has learned a particular type of discipline through her practice of Islam and following the daily prayers that's then had an impact on how she understands the discipline of science. Another thing that I want to talk to you about is the way in which science and faith need each other during these particular times. And now I want to turn to talking some about another book project that we've been working on. And this particular book, the most recent book that I've written, called Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. It's already gotten a little dark here in Houston, so let me turn on my light so I can see. I write about 8 values, 8 shared values in this particular book, but I wrote this book in particular to be a resource to practicing Christians and those who care more broadly about teaching religious communities and scientific communities how to work together for the common good. And I would love to talk to you all night, but I know that our time together is limited. So I want to talk briefly about 2 of the 8 common values that I discuss in the book. First, the value of curiosity. I want to start by telling you a story that I tell in the book. When I met Jill, she was already at the top of her field. She was a biologist leading a successful laboratory at an elite research university. I walked into her office and I immediately noticed her door had a sign of the Darwin fish eating the Christian fish, or the ichthus symbol. I was conducting my first study at that time on what scientists think about faith, and the sign that she had made me nervous. I knocked tentatively. I thought it would be okay if perhaps Jill had forgotten the appointment for our interview, I thought, but instead she came to the door right away, a little bit to my disappointment. She really did nothing to put me at ease. She didn't greet me with a handshake or a smile. Instead, she curtly asked me to come in and directed me to sit on a metal chair across the desk from her. I really can't remember now, as I think back on that time many years later, if the room was cold or if I just felt cold because of the situation. One of the questions, and when I was surveying scientists, that I often asked them is if they currently practice a religion. And she said, no, I'm simply an atheist. I then asked her whether she'd been raised in a faith tradition. It was the type of question that I think could have been answered with a yes or a no. I was really taken aback when Jill looked at me and she actually started to tear up. I have done nearly 2,000 interviews with scientists, and I cannot remember another time when a scientist that I interviewed actually started to cry as a result of a question that I asked them. I noticed that my sense of apprehension about interviewing Jill actually turned to a sense of compassion, and I wanted to know more about why the question of her faith background elicited such emotion. Jill told me that she came from a family that as a child, she spent a lot of time at church. She also spent a lot of time outdoors, and she began to see the beauty in nature and to develop a real love of the natural world and for science. But as she became more curious, Jill also became concerned about aspects of her faith. For instance, while scientists had determined that the earth is billions of years old, her church was part of a community of Christians who read the Bible in such a way that it taught the earth was created by God in its present form just thousands of years ago. Jill was also deeply curious at that point about whether Christians could even be scientists at all. At that point, she was just a young kid and she didn't know whether she would go into science. and she wasn't yet considering whether or not she would remain a part of a church. She was simply an inquisitive kid, a curious person, and she was following and feeding her natural curiosity. But when I asked hard questions, she told me, I was told by my pastor, by my youth group leaders, just to make a decision to believe, to forget about science, she said. It was an answer that really didn't quite satisfy Jill. She said, I feel like religion was a judgment that was passed on people who were different. And for me, in my personal history, in my childhood, it was judgment. It didn't work out so well for me. By the time Jill was in her teens, she had left her church. What does it mean to nurture curiosity? As a character trait, the philosopher Elias Baumgarten writes, curiosity is a kind of a disposition. It's a desire to want to know more or learn more about a wide variety of things. The more one has this character trait, the more often or the more intensely one will on particular occasions experience a desire or urge to investigate and learn about something. I think that as I've done these studies and I've reflected as a social scientist in our culture, that the word curious seems small and even weak. It brings to mind a child wondering what's around the corner before she takes a look. I think we prefer in our culture much stronger words, especially in these pandemic times. We're looking for words like expert, leader, winner. We want to be next to people who seem like they already know the whole truth. But the most successful scientists that I've studied report that they often had their curiosity nurtured from a very young age, often nurtured by their families, and for some, even in their faith communities. For example, I think of someone like the string theorist, Sylvester James Gates Jr., who's the first African-American to have an endowed chair in physics at a major research university. He speaks publicly about the relationship between science and religion, and in particular in his own life about the importance of curiosity. Gates says that he got used to being curious at a young age when he asked questions of his dad. And he recounted a conversation where he had with his dad, where he said, "Dad, do you remember me asking you all kinds of questions?" And Gates said to his dad, "It always seemed like you knew the answer." And his dad said back to him, "It wasn't that I always knew the answer, it's that I wanted you to remain curious and I wanted you to keep asking the hard questions. So if I didn't know the answer, I'd wait and then I'd go find someone that did, or I go read something and then I come back to you with the answer to your question. But it was more important to me just to nurture that sense of curiosity that you had as a child." For some in the Christian community, I think the sense of curiosity that science brings can seem even risky or scary. For Jill, her questions about faith seem scary to her parents and to her pastors. But in fact, I think the Christian faith, and I think this is common in many faith traditions, really calls on us to be curious. There's a book a colleague and friend of mine at Chico State University, Greg Kutsona, has written in particular about the Christian faith and science, where he says, whatever human knowledge discovers in nature, we are bound to listen, to learn, and to engage with it. Why? Because from a Christian sense, God has spoken and continues to speak through the Bible and through the natural world, both words and works, albeit in different modes. So we need to wrestle with what it means to nurture curiosity in faith communities, curiosity about the natural world and about science. I also want to touch on the value of shalom and its twin value of justice. In my interview with scientists who are Christians, I found that many of them draw on the concepts of shalom and stewardship. Actually, shalom is a robust concept that's talked a lot about in the Jewish tradition. It's a Hebrew word that comes from a root that means completeness and perfection. And it's the peace, harmony, well-being, and prosperity and the flourishing of the world. As a sociologist, I think about these virtues and values of shalom and stewardship, and their related virtue of justice is something that I've pondered a lot. We care a lot in our discipline about helping the other, not only person to person, individual kinds of help, but also understanding and changing structures in societies. This is directly related to something scientists care a lot about, caring for the environment. In one survey I conducted, I found that actually 28% of those who think of themselves as evangelical Christians and 31% of those who are part of the mainline Protestant denomination, so Presbyterians, Methodists, and the like, say that they're actually very interested in caring for the environment. If you merge together the somewhat interested and very interested categories, over 50% of Christians in those traditions say that they're interested in caring for the environment. But climate and environment scientists have sometimes told me that they meet Christians, even those in their own faith communities, who are actually hesitant or suspicious to discuss caring for the environment and the connection to their faith as a piece of Christian stewardship. And actually that some Christians, I'm sure those in this call will be no stranger to this, are actually quite vocal against environmental efforts, and that some worry that placing so much emphasis on caring for the environment will lead us to neglect caring for humans. And I have experienced these attitudes firsthand in my own studies. I remember interviewing a youth minister who said that, yeah, I think if we have the opportunity, we should take care of this planet we've been given. Having said that, I also believe that the value of human life is so much higher than that of a whale or a species of monkey. So really wanting to hold this kind of juxtaposition between caring for the environment and placing too much emphasis on there and caring for animals versus the much higher value placed on caring for human life. Of course, those of us who study these issues know that environmental degradation hurts the poorest of the poor in our world the most, because most environmental trauma is happening in poor nations or in poor communities. Many Christian scientists, however, see environmental care or climate change as very tied to caring for people, as I just said, and as a way we can fulfill our responsibilities to be stewards for the earth. Another issue that some of the Christians in science I interviewed talked about is related to this whole issue of justice and shalom, in particular, increasing representation and equality in science as a way of really caring about the well-being and flourishing of all people through giving all people access to science and to scientific work and the possibility of being involved in scientific work. When we look at the US scientific community, we see that non-whites, especially African Americans and Hispanic individuals, are vastly underrepresented in science. For example, I can give you lots of statistics, but just one, Black Americans comprise about 12 to 14% of the US population, depending on where you are in the country, but they make up just under 1% of the US scientific workforce. Women of all ethnic and racial groups are also underrepresented, especially in the basic sciences and some forms of medicine. They, of course, represent a little bit more than 50% of the population, but less than 10% in many scientific fields, especially fields like physics. Yet African Americans, Hispanics, and women are all overrepresented in churches, meaning a higher proportion of them are involved in churches than their natural occurrence in the general population. For example, nearly 80% of African Americans see themselves as Christians. Nearly 70% of Hispanics see themselves as Christians. One reason, according to lots of research, that African Americans and Hispanics are underrepresented in science is that they are more likely, of course, to attend lower resource schools with poor science education. But a related problem that I find through my research is that Christians from minority groups often don't hear about scientists who believe like them or see scientists who look like them. One Christian geneticist I interviewed for one of my studies was one of the few Black women in her field at an elite university. She said that during the 5 years she spent as a graduate student, that there was only one Black speaker brought in for her department's weekly seminar. She said there were about 100 seminars during that time and only one Black speaker brought in that entire time. One Black pastor said to me during an interview that for a lot of African Americans, science is a no trespassing zone because you're Black and because you're a Christian. Representation matters, and the lack of representation of women, minorities, and Christians in science is the kind of issue that I think ought to concern churches and ought to concern other types of faith communities. Those who have been or are the most marginalized in our society are often deeply compelled to fight structures and engage in efforts that lessen marginalization to another, and their social location brings a very distinctive thing to science, which can be generative to science itself, aside from even the kinds of concerns for equity of making sure that everyone has access to science. A Christian biologist also told me that his focus on the values underlying stewardship and shalom have actually helped him connect with non-religious colleagues in science and earn their respect and support. He said, "We stand on common ground in what we hope our scientific work will accomplish. And they can see," he said, "that I'm working to really serve the common good, to build bridges, to work for peace. And that counts for so much for them, even if they disagree on the particulars." I want to talk in the remaining segment of our time together about the broader work of the Religion and Public Life program, a share of which is very much focused on religion and science, but also where we focus on other topics related to religion and public life. The vision of our program in particular is to use research. So we take seriously that we are located at a top research university at Rice University, and we want to use our location at a premier research university to do cutting edge research on religion in public life, and then to use that research to reach out to others, to understand the needs of others, and to try to provide our research to them, to build common ground so they can pick up our research and utilize it for common good initiatives. We accomplish this through three kinds of things that we're very much focused on our program, which those on the call who are from our program hear me talk about a lot. We want to do the very best research, top-notch research, and then we want to go do everything we can to connect to community members, to translate our research, to bring it to the relevant communities that we think it might be useful for, and actually to listen to those communities and to try to figure out how we might do better research that would be more useful to them. And we want to take pedagogy seriously, that we are very much about training the next generation of thought leaders through the kinds of students that come to Rice University, which I and others in our program get the privilege of working with. Our work is very globally focused, so I won't repeat that here, but just another way of showing you, as I did at the beginning of this talk, the proportion of people who are religiously involved. So even if you are not personally religious, I think you can agree with me that understanding all the way that religion matters globally is extremely valuable research pursuit. Some of our work is very concerned with understanding how religious organizations and religious peoples address or do not address global poverty. We are very interested in working with others on the Rice University campus to understand how the religiosity of communities has an impact in the adaptation and adoption of cutting-edge medical technologies, especially in the developing world. We're also very concerned, especially in this moment, about understanding the ways in which religion has an impact on public life in the broader US. We've done a lot of work on religion and politics and religious discrimination and religion in the workplace, and religious discrimination in the workplace, and integration of faith and work in particular. In the US, according to some of our recent studies, we find that 89% of the US public, depending on survey, has a firm belief in God. 79% of the US public is religiously affiliated. And so we study all the ways in which religion comes up in public life in our national context. We are seeing just the need for our work to take a sharp turn to address the pandemic. And we have worked really hard in the last weeks. I'm really, really proud of our 20-person team in the Religion and Public Life program of undergraduates, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, full-time research and programming staff, other faculty who have just turned our attentions very quickly to addressing the pandemic. We have written op-eds, we have been interviewed on National Public Radio, and we have tried to do all we can within our energy and resources to address the situation very directly in a way which can be useful. Here are just a few of the successes. We do a lot of surveys. So we have conducted over the past 10 years of our existence, 13 national and international studies in 9 nations. Most of our research is funded through grants, and I acknowledge some of those at the beginning of the talk, but we have had grants from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, the John Templeton Foundation, also the National Science Foundation, the Lilly Endowment. We're very, very thankful for those donors. All of our programming and our research translation is privately funded through independent donations. And we think of ourselves as building a bridge to those no one else is reaching. We're the only entity on the Rice University campus. And really, I think Rice is at the leading edge for many university campuses in having a robust program that is concerned with sharing research directly to religious people and religious communities and increasing dialogue in the public sphere. We are very proud recently that we've had the chance through a private gift to hold nearly 30 religious and civic leader gatherings. So we have for 300 people who participate regularly in events that happen about once a month, where I or a student or another scholar will share just a small bit of research, and then those who are religious and civic and academic leaders will get together. They'll discuss the research in a safe environment. Pre-pandemic times, I often had those events in my home. I actually convinced my husband that we needed a significantly larger house so that I could host more folks from Rice and the community in my home. But a kind of bright side of the pandemic has been that we've been able to move those religious and civic leader gatherings to be national gatherings now. And if you're interested in being invited to those, I would encourage you to reach out to me or to our program manager, Haley Hemstreet, and I will put that information on the last slide of this presentation. We're proud of those religious and civic leader gatherings because these folks are those who have influence over others. And we counted up the size of their organizations, and those 300 people that we're involved with have a constituent reach of 50,000 people. And that's really exciting for us that our research potentially has such an impact to a much wider community than the 300 people who are involved in those gatherings. We also hold large public events, which you're welcome to attend via Zoom. This year, we have a really active group of programming coming up. We've hosted 86 public events. We've had more than 5,000 people sitting in seats at Rice University attending those events. We also take training very seriously. This is one of our fellows who has a faculty position but worked with us for many years, Cleve Tinsley. We have worked with 105 junior and senior scholars. This includes undergraduate students. We've worked with 70 undergraduate students in research, graduate students, post-baccalaureate fellows, postdoctoral fellows, full-time staff, and faculty. If you would like to stay in touch with us, happy to do that. My personal email address is ehe@rice.edu. So my initials, ehe@rice.edu, and you're welcome if you're on this call to email me. And then I put our program email there. There's our Facebook page. We're quite active on Twitter and other forms of social media. So at this point, I'll stop sharing the screen, and I'll look forward to looking in the chat window, I think, and answering some questions from you all. Really appreciate being here. Appreciate the kind of attentiveness you've had at this late hour for many, and just really, really honored by your being willing to discuss these ideas with me. Thanks so much.
Elaine, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I hope you can hear the virtual thunderous applause that is no doubt emanating from everyone's
yes, and I can see those thumbs up I can. Yes, this is a different kind of format, isn't it?
Yeah, and your talk was wonderful, and so we are so appreciative that you have been able to be with us tonight. And a lot of questions have now come in on the chat panel, and I think we will try to get through as many of these as we can. I don't know how your stamina is going to bear up, but I think we have probably several hours worth of questions. But we'll see.
I'll just go. Is it okay with you, Nels, if I just go right through them, just rapid fire? And then you had said that people might be interested in asking live questions as well. So I
Yeah.
see that I think I have 14 messages. Some of them look complex, so I'll try my best. Some of them may require some email follow-up or something, and I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
So for the sample of scientist research, is there any data concerning their disciplines? More biologists were atheists compared to computer science majors, et cetera. So some of our other research, I have an earlier book through the Religion and Public Life program that's called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think. And that's a book that came out in 2010. I mentioned that book because we studied 7 disciplines for that book, and we were very concerned with looking at the difference between the natural science disciplines and the social science disciplines. In the particular international study that I talked about tonight, in the US, there was not much difference religiously between the biologists and physicists, but in some national contexts, there really was. In the UK, regardless of the university type, physicists tended to be much more religious than biologists. And so we actually asked, what's really fun is that when you do research with scientists, you can ask them, you can like put your hypotheses to them and ask them what they think, and they have really clever ideas. And one of the working hypotheses I have is that there's a real history in the UK of outspoken religious physicists. You think of someone like Michael Faraday and others, and this is what the scientists themselves told me. So you have to decide whether you think that's accurate. But I do some more analysis of disciplinary differences in that first book as well on scientists' attitudes towards religion, the 2010 book. But I can point you to some other articles that we've written as well. Another question, please elaborate on the factors you believe are underlying the Hong Kong and Taiwan statistics. So we actually had 6 co-authors for that book, and one of them, Stephen Lewis, is a very well-known China expert and Chinese society expert, a political scientist. And one of the things that Stephen and I have written and talked about is that there is a pretty big impact in Hong Kong on the education system from Catholic missionization to Hong Kong. And so many of the best schools in Hong Kong are actually Catholic educational institutions. And so there is the sense through that there's not any kind of inconsistency. There's almost like a pipeline for Catholic and for scientists who are Christians through into the science pipeline. In Taiwan, the impact on the educational system is more Protestant than Catholic, and also a mission effort. Taiwan in particular, if I had more time, I have a table in my our book, which shows all of the diverse religious traditions that are present in Taiwan. Taiwan is really a religiously plural society, and a place where religion is discussed quite openly in ways that it's not in the scientific community in the US or UK, for example. And so the scientists in those national contexts, for different kinds of reasons, I think, see there as being no inconsistency between being a person of faith and being a scientist. And even especially in the case of Hong Kong, there's a certain type of pipeline. One of the scientists we interviewed in Hong Kong had this funny thing he said that really stuck with us. He said, in Hong Kong, it's like there's a kind of Christian mafia in science where it's almost not okay to be a Christian and be a scientist. In fact, there's a kind of like preferential funding stream for Christians. So we really interrogated that, and we talk about that some in our book. So concerning those who saw religion and science as separate and those who saw collaboration, this idea that science cannot prove or disprove the existence of God seems separate from the idea that science and religion perspectives on some issues might be useful and collaborative. Yes, I would agree. Genetic modification, climate change, social equity are some possibilities. Yeah, I mean, I think the questioner asks and makes a really good point. And this is perhaps where it's a bit different to be a philosopher, a theologian thinking through science and religion, and a sociologist thinking through science and religion. So sociologists do not challenge our respondents. So we never say, oh, like, gosh, the way you're viewing things seem really inconsistent to me. Like you haven't thought about it clearly enough. So this wouldn't be the kind of thing. We really want to understand. The conversation is very one-sided when you're doing an interview, a sociology interview. You really want to understand how respondents see things in their own terms. And so I would say that to the questioner that sometimes people did bring up those kind of nuances, but more often they didn't. They hadn't thought very, from my point of view, very deeply often about those kinds of distinctions. But I think that's a good, and we do address some of those issues in our broader work. We have another book that our team has written called Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. Maybe Haley, if you're on the call, you can put up the links to some of those books. I don't know if others can write in so the folks can see those. And so from I like a discussion of this point. Science can't tell you what you can believe, but it can tell you what you can no longer believe. I think that's a good point. Again, I want to draw you back to this idea that that's not really my role as a sociologist to comment on such a thing, right? So I'm trying to understand what people think in their own terms. I would say that was very much the view, particularly among those scientists who were Christians or who had been Christians in the past, that they're in the U.S. in particular, the religion, in the UK to some extent, there's a particular focus on science and religion discussion, really being discussion at its core of Christianity and its connection or lack of connection to science. And those who wanted to focus around Christianity were very much focused on interrogating belief systems. And so the ideas of Christianity, the ideas of science, to what extent are they compatible or not? Muslims, for example, and actually Hindus to some extent, when we looked at scientists in Turkey and India respectively, focused much more on religion as a set of practices. And consequently, they focused on science as a set of practices as well. So it wasn't that they had a different scientific method, but they saw the connection between science and religion as being about different things than a conflict or lack of conflict between belief systems. We talk a lot about that in our book. Here's someone who's been a missionary in China, identifying what it means to be religious, extremely challenging. So just asking if one is religious may not have captured the broad spectrum of religious traditions. So this was actually a survey that had 87 questions on it. And sadly, this is an academic trying to give you really the top shelf kinds of findings. And I would encourage you to go back to our broader book if you're really interested in this topic, particularly the chapter on Taiwan and Hong Kong. We also have a 40-page treatment in the book about definitions of religion, and then a 40-page appendix about how we did the study for those of you who get really excited about such things. And we asked a lot of different kinds of questions about differences in religion. So the problem you run into with surveys is you want very much to understand the particularities of each national or regional context, but you also want to have comparability. So you want a portion of your survey to be able to understand consistency of concept across these cross-national contexts, right? Otherwise, you're just doing, in my case, 8 separate studies of distinct nations with no way of really comparing them. And we actually found when we did focus groups with scientists in the national context, so we did a bunch of focus groups before we even started the survey to test our survey questions. we found, and this was very surprising to me as a methodologist, we found that the question, to what extent are you religious, had remarkable consistency and meaning across national contexts. People might mean different things by religion, but they know what they mean. Religion means the same kind of thing in each of these national contexts. Obviously, the whole set of folk religions that are practiced in Taiwan is very different than Protestant Christianity in the US. So that's very true. And we asked about those distinctive things in each of the contexts as well. But that's an excellent question. Among scientists, how does religious attitudes correlate with other backgrounds like gender and ethnicity? Do you think the religion and science dialogue is relevant to diversity and inclusivity in science? So I have written a couple of pieces about this recently, about racism, religion, and science, and about gender, religion, and science. And I'm happy to have you look up those articles or to send you the links if folks are interested. So just to answer the question more briefly than it deserves to be answered for lack of time, we do find that gender, for example, has a different relationship dependent on national context. So for example, in the US, irreligious women seem to self-select into science. So men and women in science do not tend to be very religiously different in the US as they are in the general population. So in the scientific community, they're not religiously different, whereas in the general population in the US, women are quite a bit more religious than men, really in any way you measure religion. And so when we look at one way that we kind of approximate change is by asking scientists about their religion at age 16 and then their religion currently. And we find that women who were not raised in any religious tradition disproportionately select into science. I've written quite a bit about that, and I'm happy to follow up on that. We do find also, so I've done another set of studies, our team at the Religion and Public Life program, I should say, to honor the other people on these studies. We've done another big set of studies about, especially in the US, about different religious groups and their attitudes towards science. And we find that racial minorities, underrepresented racial minorities, particularly Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, tend to feel that they are being kept out of science, both because of their religion and because of their race and the kind of connection between those things. I actually, in a few weeks, we have a lecture, and we'll send more information about this. We have a lecture that's cooperative with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where we're talking specifically about the connection between diversity in science and religion in science. And I do think that there is a really interesting connection to be made. And I've become super, super interested in this issue, especially in the past couple of years. It's very, very important for us to think about. Another question, to what extent do scientists believe in active communication with God via revelation and inspiration and answers to personal prayer, scientific observation, or ancient traditions revelation? In one of my books, I think it's the Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think, we talk about scientists' attitudes towards religion, what we call everyday scientists. So scientists who work outside, no scientist is an everyday scientist. I shouldn't say that, scientists are always special. But so by that, I mean scientists who work in research and development for corporations, who work at laboratories. Those who are outside of research universities tend to be a bit more like the general population religiously. Those who work at research universities tend to be distinctive in some ways. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you want to pick up on that theme. But we do find that there is real variation, that some scientists believe in miracles. They had very well articulated ways of understanding from a Christian tradition point of view the possibility of miracles and scientific, alongside their scientific work and understanding. There are many scientists associated with religiously affiliated higher education institutions. Yes, that's true. Have you considered, most of them do, have science departments of various sorts. Have you considered conducting surveys and interviews with these scientists to see how they may reconcile their faith with science, where the religiosity more present and overt? That is a great question, and we have not done those studies. There is a faculty member, his name is escaping me right now, at Baylor University, who's done some studies of faith-based institutions, but we have not on our team. What about atheist scientists who've accepted our Christian cultural values and are very moral? Glad you asked that question. I really labored. I was told I had about 40 to 50 minutes max, and I think I even went over those minutes, and I had a whole section of this talk about varieties of atheism that I took out at the last minute because I wasn't going to be able to hit both of the books if I included so much about scientists. My colleague David Johnson at University of Nevada, Reno, and David was formerly a postdoctoral fellow with the Religion and Public Life program, is now a faculty member at University of Nevada. He and I have actually just submitted for publication a book called Varieties of Atheism in Science. And so we talk, and that's going to be coming out with Oxford University Press next year. And so we talk extensively about just that's been one of the most surprising and interesting pieces of my study. I hope I've whet your appetite by saying this, because I didn't even get to discuss this wonderful material with you tonight, and I love this stuff. To me, one of the most surprising things that I've discovered so far in this research is that there are so many different types of atheist scientists. And I think we're led to believe through these very loud public voices that there's one way of being an atheist and a scientist, and that's someone like Richard Dawkins. And we found resoundingly that that's not the case through our research, which is the fun of doing research, right? When you find things that really blow apart public stereotypes. I love that. Woo, I got my chat going a little too fast there. I'm scrolling a little too fast. I want to skip anything. Do you ever get the sense from the interviews of how comfortable religious scientists are with being open about their faith among their colleagues? Yes, I do. And that's been another fun thing to think about, or not fun, depending on your perspective. So I remember one interview I did in particular. You all, some of you are probably familiar enough with social science research to know about institutional review boards or human subjects guidelines. So one of the things, this is kind of a setup for this little story, but one of the things that we have to do is we cannot share with even people in our study who else has participated in the study. So it's all confidential. And so sometimes I'll be interviewing scientists at the same institution. And I remember one time in particular where I was interviewing a scientist who, she was a biologist, she was in her office, and when I walked in, she was actually preparing for the Sunday school class that she was going to teach in her Episcopal church. And I said, see, I saw this big Bible open on her desk. I don't know if she was doing it like for effect, but as I kind of probed deeper, I mean, it seemed incredibly genuine that she was totally preparing for this study that she was going to teach this Sunday. And she said throughout our interview, I'm a religious person. And when I asked her perception of how many scientists in her department were religious, so I actually asked scientists their perception of the number of religious scientists, and then we surveyed the whole department confidentially so we could know their perception. Does that make sense? So we could actually study the difference between scientists' individual perceptions of the proportion of religious scientists compared to how many religious scientists there really were. And so this woman said she was certain that not one other scientist in her department was religious. And then I actually went out of her office. I went around the entire building and came back in an alternative entrance so I could sneakily interview the man who was right next door to her, who had an office right next door to her. So very sadly, this gentleman, and also in her field of biology, had lost his spouse earlier that same year. And he said he was a very committed Catholic, and he was really rediscovering his faith during his time of grief. And he actually said a kind of haunting line to me, which was that he wished that he could talk to someone in his department, because he spent so much time there and he had so many close friendships with his colleagues. He wished he could talk to someone about his interest in faith, in particular during this time in his life. But he said he was certain that no one else in his department was religious. And these two faculty were colleagues for many, many years, and like had the offices right next door to each other. So that told me something. What are your thoughts on debates between theistic evolutionists and creationists within religious communities? I actually have a chapter on that topic in the new book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. This book is a really different book than others that I and members of our team have written. It's a book written specifically for Christian communities, and we don't have any other book like it. But we have identified through our research that the particular kinds of communities that we write for in this book are the communities that really have struggled in the US, at least, with these tensions between faith and science. And so we felt very compelled to write a book that would translate our research directly to them. And we write a chapter in that book about this topic, about evolution. And there is a lot at stake for folks, but we find in our research that people, if they understand what theistic evolution is, this idea that somehow God was involved in using evolutionary theory for the development, especially of humankind, that actually as long as God is involved somehow, everyday people really have no problem with theistic evolution. Most do not seem to know that is an option. Most folks don't have, they're not like you all who read about these things all the time. Most everyday people do not have much exposure to these different debates or the kinds of nuances in the debates, or different thinkers to support different views. They just don't have very much access to that kind of information. So we tried to write a really easy to understand chapter about this topic. You can get in touch with me and see if you agree after you read it in terms of whether or not it's easy to understand. I found your arguments of shared values in science and faith more convincing for the section on this is someone who's read the book. Thank you. More convincing for the section on process, curiosity, doubt, humility, and creativity and redemptive value than those in the section on redemption, healing, shalom, and gratitude. My feeling was that my understanding of healing, shalom, and gratitude was much more dependent on my faith or social background rather than my science background. That's really interesting. So I think the questioner is, or the commenter is saying that they do not necessarily find healing, shalom, and gratitude to be something that for them is picked up on in the scientific environment, which could very much be true. Is that more because I'm into physical than biological sciences? It could be. That's a really interesting perspective. I didn't notice that. I didn't notice that like there were massive disciplinary differences in the scientific types that those values came out in, but that's something for me to think about more. I think maybe we could have studied that more robustly. That's a really interesting comment. Thank you, Haley, for putting links to things. I find surveys to be deeply problematic. Me too. I agree with the questioner. Usually by the third question, I find that I cannot answer because I don't understand what the question means. And, you know, especially if you're a scientist, scientists are very thoughtful and very apt to deconstruct things. So if you're a scientist, don't consider yourself like the general population. I find that I cannot answer because I don't understand what the question means. And even if the survey is done live, the question will not clarify. Did you get that kind of reaction? Very much so. People actually, this was always very funny to me because any of the scientists that we've surveyed would write me long pages, which would start with, I don't have time to participate in this survey. And then they would then commence to writing me 3 single-spaced pages about the problems that they had with the survey. So I'm like, wow, you don't have time to participate in a 10-minute survey, but you have time to write me a long essay about not participating, which I really appreciate because we took those comments and we made our surveys better. So I have to admit that I am a physicist. I should have read a little bit further before starting the answer. And well known in my church and Bible study as someone who overthinks things. My husband's a physicist too, so I'm really predisposed to be sympathetic to physicists. He's a particle physicist. And I always have him do my surveys before I then inflict them on the general population of physicists. And then the last couple of years, I've stopped that because I don't want so much feedback. You can never get started if you overthink things too much. But I think you're exactly right. I think it's best to couple surveys with other kinds of methods and to include some open-ended questions on surveys, especially about tricky concepts where you allow people to write in answers. Now, you probably know, as those folks on this call are well-versed in quantitative methods, that even when you allow people to write in answers, to be able to analyze them statistically, you in the end have to analyze them and codify them so they fit into your existing categories, if that makes sense. Surveys are really imperfect, but what they do allow is some kind of comparability across questions, and you can do large numbers of them so you can get high ends. In-depth interviews are much harder to analyze, but do allow people to talk about things in their own terms, ask for clarification of concepts, have a ton of back and forth. I mean, we've had 3 or 4 hour conversations with scientists, depending on the national context. Some people are very, very interested in these things. We've also had 8-minute conversations. Some people are not interested at all. But the interview as a methodological tool really does allow a kind of depth and nuance that you don't get through a survey. But I still think surveys are very important. They're easy to quantify. They do allow for comparability. They allow you to study things over time easily. And I also think with our particular research, we spend a lot of time flying to places and going to places. Of course, not possible now, sadly. But we did spend a lot of time in the national context so that we could understand what was going on by observing things as well. So we used what we think of as the trifecta of methods. We observed things, we interviewed, and we surveyed. Can we take your survey? Oh, I love that. That's so fun. So actually in the back of all of our books, we put the entire survey just so you can take it at will and see how you compare to others, if that's fun for you. I think that's it. Nels, did you want to go for live now?
Okay, well, how do you feel then, Elaine? You've been working pretty hard now for well over an hour, but I know there will be interest in asking questions if we open it up. So
yeah, no, I'm happy to stay longer. I really enjoy this kind of thing. I have to say that I realize, of course, that you're all muted, so that's why you're not laughing at my jokes. But okay. So, but it is an interesting experience, isn't it, to give these talks over Zoom without the more live interaction, but it's also allowing us to get a lot more people involved, which is really neat as a net benefit.
I think it's an art form all its own. But we're all learning how to do that. Well,
we certainly are.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And let's continue now. Let's see if anyone wants to raise their hand. What you do is you go to the participant feature in your Zoom menu, click on the participants, and at the bottom you will see a button where you can raise your hand. And I see a hand raised from William Phillips, and I think he is unmuted. So please go ahead with your question.
Okay, well, thank you, Elaine, for a lovely talk.
Thanks.
As a reaction to one of the questions, I think it was Eric who asked it, about the different perspectives that, say, physicists and biologists might have. Many years ago, I participated in the Templeton-funded study called Science and the Spiritual Quest, the second incarnation of that study. And we had physics and cosmology as a group, and we had biology as a group, and we met together one time. And one of the interesting things that came out was that while physicists generally looked at the world and the universe as being beautiful and orderly, biologists tend to look at the world as being ugly and messy. And I'm wondering whether you found any of that in your surveys, and whether you felt that it had any influence on the larger picture of the relationship between faith and science for those two different groups.
I did not notice that kind of distinction between those two disciplines when looking at scientists in large numbers. So our N for our survey is quite large. I'm familiar with the study you just mentioned, which was a great study, but our N is quite large even compared to that study. The thing that I did notice, which I think you might be hitting on in a roundabout way, is that applied and what we might think of as more basic research tend to draw a different type of person. Those who are involved in engineers on the call will not like this, but if we think of engineering as a type of applied physics, and so we think of the difference between someone who's, say, a theorist versus, or even who's not a theorist, who's doing something more applied even within basic research, those types of people tend to be a bit religious, the people who are doing basic research, when compared to the folks who are doing applied research. And I've always tried to get a graduate student or a postdoc or someone to pick that up. I think that's kind of interesting, actually. In the US population, engineers are quite religious. They tend to be as religious or more religious than the general population. But I wonder if what you're saying is somehow related to that, that, those who do applied work have to somehow make things fit together in a way that works, right? Whereas others can sit with the messiness in a different kind of way. I just, that's something I've been using on. I don't really have anything beyond that, but that's a great question, really good insight.
Do we have any more questions? Once again, press the raise hand button in the participant panel.
I think Barry is raising his real hand.
Okay.
If that's allowed, yes.
Would that be Barry Schaefer?
Yes.
By any chance? Okay, he's ready to go.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can.
You can hear me. Okay. A little bit of background. I just reached the big 8-0. Okay.
Ah, fantastic.
And for 63 years, I've been talking to people about this subject.
Oh,
And
fun.
when I was 17, I started college, and that's the first time I encountered someone who did not. And the majority of my friends are strict empiricists, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I say probably 95%. And yet I go to church and say the Nicene Creed almost every week. It's filled with miracles.
Mm-hmm.
And I just happen to believe they're true. And so I see empiricists and Orthodox Christianity as disjoint sets, okay? So I'm a bit more of a pessimist than you are, I'd say. So I just wanted to get your comment on that.
I don't really have any personal sense of that, but I can tell you what, there is definitely a set of scientists. I don't know how this sits with you. So there's definitely a set of scientists like you that would see these things as, I don't know if you're saying that you feel that they're compartmentalized, but
Well,
that see these things, even if one partakes of both of them, as not necessarily being able to be reconciled. There is a set of scientists, now we're talking, I think more from a Christian understanding, who, I just lost my earphone there, folks, sorry about that. We are seeing, who definitely do see, God as, so they would say like God is over all of the world, and that a God who created science can also,
exactly.
interact within its realm or outside its realm, but is sort of supra science. I think that's how they see things, and that it's not, science is not supra God, if that makes sense. So I'm sure you've heard this view before, but there's definitely a contingent of scientists who are, as you say, Orthodox Christians, who would hold that view and not see the things as being in conflict.
But if you're an empiricist, a virgin birth is impossible except for parthenogenesis, in which case it would be a boy, a girl rather, but and resurrection from the dead impossible, right? I mean,
well, that's not the kind of, I know this, I hope this doesn't feel to you like a cop-out answer. It's not the kind of question sociology can answer, right? So
yeah.
what we are more concerned about is the distribution of certain perspectives in the social world.
Okay.
So
Well,
yeah, there's definitely folks who think that that is certainly impossible, and say that it's because of their scientific understanding. And there's also scientists that say, you know, because of their view of science, they think of it as possible, but not as able to be explained through science, for sure.
okay. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, sure, sure. Lots of books been written about this. I'm sure you know of them. But if you need, I can tell you one of the questions we asked on our survey, which was kind of fun, and we actually never did anything with it. Like, you get tired of these things after a while of writing articles and articles from the same study. But we asked it from our interviews, what books were influential on the scientists about the science and faith perspective. So we have, you know, over 600, these are just of the scientists that we interview. We have over 600 scientists in 8 different nations' views of the important books in this space. And I've never done anything with that piece of data, but I have lists and lists. Other questions?
Hi. Yeah, I was just unmuted, and thank you very much for this talk. So I have another question. I wonder if you recorded the like how far the scientists you interviewed are in their career. Like, so is there like a correlation between like whether a graduate student or postdoc or like assistant professors or like a tenured professors and or like a more senior professors and so on? Like, is there a correlation between that and like religious attitudes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have written an article about, we call it rank in science, for lack of a better way to describe it. So we actually compared graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, assistant, associate, and full professors, or the equivalent in national context. So for example, the Italian scientific system does not map onto those categories in the same way. There are graduate students every place, but then the faculty ranks are different in different national contexts. And we did find in some of the national contexts, actually, that the younger scientists or the more junior scientists, so graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, tended to be a little bit more religious. And so we think, I've written one piece about this just as relates to US science in a journal called Social Forces, an older piece. It seems that it's more of a cohort difference rather than a life course difference. So a cohort difference would be that maybe there's a group of scientists like who are coming into science and they're different than, say, younger scientists. So younger scientists now are different than younger scientists were 30 years ago in terms of the religiosity. Or it could be the case that people start out religious, and this would be a life course position. People start out religious and then they become less religious as they progress across the life course of the scientific career. It seems that there's a cohort difference, that there's a bit more acceptance now of being religious or being spiritual. Spirituality is something I didn't even touch on in this talk at all, and I've actually written quite a bit about spirituality in science outside of traditional religion, that there's a bit of a sea change, and that there's a cohort of younger scientists, especially in the US and UK to some extent, who are a bit more likely to be religious when compared to other scientists. This is particularly striking with respect to scientists who are Catholics, that in the US in particular, there's quite an increase in Catholic scientists when, say, compared to the scientific community 50 years ago, especially. We know this because we I did one study where we replicated the Carnegie Commission National Faculty Study with the same universities and same questions, so we could compare cohorts over time. Other questions?
Elaine, are you willing to keep talking or?
Yeah, just for a few more minutes. That would be
Okay.
great. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Elaine, I think you've covered a very broad range of topics, and we are so grateful to you for, well, among other things, for your endurance. I think this was just wonderful to have you be able to spend so much time with us. So thank you very much. I see a hand raised from Barry Schaefer once again. If you have a little time, maybe we can.
I do, yeah. Barry, hit me again.
We'll need to unmute Barry Schaefer.
Unmute. Yeah, this is about you, Nils, because you told me you were born in India. Is that correct?
My parents were missionaries in India.
Yeah, but
were
you born there?
I grew up there.
Yeah, okay. I just thought that was an interesting perspective. And of course, they were majority Hindu, I suspect, right?
Something like that, I think.
Yeah, okay. That's just an aside.
But enough about me. Let's see. I think we're probably at the close of our evening then, Elaine. Once again, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank all of our participants too, who have asked some very good questions. And Elaine, we have never had so many people join a Zoom session as we have had tonight. And that is obviously owing to your drawing power and your credentials and wonderful productivity and the exciting kind of research you're doing. So thank you so much once again.
Oh, this is terrific.
Thank you for putting it together.
Yes, and I am happy. I see this as just the beginning of our relationship, and happy to follow up with folks if there are articles or things I mentioned you wanted some more references related to, or if you're just interested in the work of the Religion and Public Life program. As I said, there's a kind of unexpected positive to this era where folks from other places in the US could come to events via Zoom, which is really kind of fun. You've been really generous to listen to me so long tonight. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you.
Thank you. And by the way, we have recorded this evening's session, and we will endeavor to make that recording available either on YouTube, or we'll send you a Dropbox link or something like that if you are interested in watching it again or telling your friends about it.
Oh, great, great. Thank you so much, everyone. All righty, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Okay, I've saved the chat, so we have a record of all those questions.
Good deal, Nels. Thanks. I think everything went very well.
Yeah, Bob, likewise, thanks to you, Dan, Jonas, everyone. I think all the transitions were quite smooth, and I'm only aware of one person who had some trouble logging in, but maybe he ultimately was able to.
Don Burns. Don always has trouble.
Hey, Chick, thanks for some good questions. I think she liked those questions. You're muted, Chick.
She was very supportive of all the questions, I thought.
Yeah, I thought she handled them very well. Well, she's in the business of handling questions, so yeah, she did that quite well. I thought she was a great speaker too. I think very, very listenable. Okay, everyone, I've been recording, but I'm going to sign off now, and this will be the end of the recording. So,
Hey, thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.